especially in healthcare innovation, which is a very pertinent subject during this time of pandemic that we are living in today. As countries, cities, companies, and clinicians are working hard and fast to build solutions to better manage COVID-19, we are hopeful that when the going gets tough, the tough will get going. The COVID-19 pandemic has ushered in a new era of urgent innovation. In the last 4 months, it is estimated that there have been over 500 innovations in the startups domain alone in over 100 countries around the world that are already being adopted or ready to be deployed to better cope with COVID-19. And that is why we are organizing the event today to feature a spotlight on deep tech heroes who are entrepreneurs, scientists, international development experts, to share with us about their work as well as the impact of science and technology in society overall. During this event, please feel free to send in your questions so that we can all involve you in the event and address any queries that you may have. I would now like to invite Dr. Lim Jue, our CEO at SG Innovate, to get our panel started with the speakers. Dr. Lim Jue, please.
Good morning, everyone, and to our Muslim brothers and sisters, Eid Mubarak, Selamat Hari Raya Puasa again. So welcome to this session. This session is a joint effort between SG Innovate as well as the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, Center for Technology, Innovation and Sustainable Development. This is part of a broader shared mission to use deep technologies for the general good of mankind. Obviously, the current pandemic also offers us the opportunity not just to do good, but it also crystallizes the role of deep tech, what it can do in general in facing some of humanity's biggest challenges. We have a great lineup today. We have Bradley Busetto from the UNDP Center for Technology, Innovation and Sustainable Development. We have Kuldeep Singh from Bioformis, a startup company that SG Innovate has helped along. And that's the same for Structo, another startup company. I'm gonna let Kuldeep and Hoob from Structo tell you more about those companies. And then we also have Professor Dean Ho, a very, very distinguished academic, in many ways the exemplar of the scholar entrepreneur. So welcome, and let's get this on the road. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to ask our very, very valued partner, Bradley Busetto, to say a few words about his Center for Technology, Innovation and Sustainable Development, as well as some broader comments on this collaboration with SGI. And then I'm going to ask each of Dean, Kuldeep, and Hoob to also talk about their work and or their companies. So, Bradley, please take it away.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Jue, and thanks so much to SG Innovate. Let me just try to share my screen, and then I'll quickly just go through a couple slides of introduction. And pleasure to see the panelists. And I already have got some ideas about potential collaboration, which I hope you'll be excited about too after a couple of minutes of my introduction. Let me just share my slides. Shoot. I think I'm having some technical problems with sharing my screen. It says host has disabled attendee screen sharing. Then I won't worry about it then. Let's see if I can do it one more time. I won't share.
Is there a way we can just quickly fix that?
Bradley, just give us one moment.
If not, I can just get right into it. Walk through it, no problem. Why don't I just go ahead and I don't need the slides, it's all right. So just a quick word about what this Center for Tech, Innovation and Sustainability is all about here in Singapore. It's the United Nations Systems first ever center with the mandate of, well, how do we leverage tech and innovation to drive sustainability across the world, and especially the developing world. So I think it makes perfect sense that we're based here in Singapore with its focus on technology and sustainability for sure. And a clear partner for us is SG Innovate. The first couple of things that we focused on in terms of our initial work streams, kind of leveraging what Singapore has to offer in particular, around smart cities and digitalization. So for example, how do we help design the first smart cities in the developing world, in Africa or South Asia? The second is around the future of food, given Singapore's 30 by 30 push. And how do we think about oh, now we've got my slides back up. Okay, great. One second. Okay. Give me 1 second. Okay. Yep. So the second work stream is around sustainable and digital agriculture, and the third planned work stream is around sustainable finance. Again, all with the idea of how do we leverage these emerging technologies to really drive sustainability in the developing world. And we quickly moved to respond to COVID-19 as well over the past weeks, months now. And we've done a couple of things. One, we've launched with Hackster, the world's largest community of developers and hardware entrepreneurs, and also with leading tech companies like Google, Amazon, and Microsoft. We've launched the COVID-19 Detect and Protect Challenge, where we're trying to crowdsource for low-cost open source solutions for the developing world, hardware solutions. And so this isn't a hackathon, but it's much more deep and I think real than a lot of hackathons are, with the backing of big tech behind it. The idea is that how do we quickly surface useful solutions for detection and protection against COVID for the developing world, especially in Africa. And working also with SG Innovate on this, and like to work with a couple of the panelists on this, and then with colleagues in the community on this as well. So we've already in the first couple of weeks identified a couple of winners, and you see those on the screen. One is around open source pulse oximeter, another is a touchless faucet, and then another face mask disinfection device. So the trick now is how do we, now that we've got these prototypes or solutions already surfaced, how do we get those to the last mile? And so we're working with our big tech partners and others and maker spaces in countries like Sierra Leone, like Uganda, other countries to actually get those available as quickly as possible. We think that this could be really transformative, could create new ways of tech transfer and driving development in moments of crisis. The other main piece of work we're doing around COVID is kind of curating a repository of open source digital tools to respond to COVID-19, like, for example, the Trace Together app out of Singapore. This was inspired by a lot of the work that Singapore did early on, but we're crowding in kind of proven, tested examples from governments and organizations from around the world. We've already had a couple of really cool initial successes where, for example, the government of Mauritius linked up with us to help them quickly build a laboratory management system to test their COVID-19 samples. So instead of spending literally millions of creating a new data management system for their labs, we just helped tweak a little bit a University of Washington data management system for labs that ends up costing them a lot less and is literally almost immediately available to them. So these are a couple of things that we're doing right away on COVID-19, and I can see obvious links with Structo and with Kuldeep's work as well. So look forward to hearing more from the experts on the panel too, and just to say that yes, this is part of a broader what we call SDG SDG Innovate, a partnership with SG Innovate. Looking forward also to launching our Deep Tech for Good initiative in the next few days, actually. I'll stop there, and then again, look forward to engaging with this great panel.
Thank you very much, Bradley. I just saw a question from the audience. This slide was frozen at slide 1, so some of them have been asked to see if they can just take a quick look at the second slide, because that provides the examples that you were talking about, Bradley.
Sure. Yeah, let me just go back to 1 second. Yeah, it doesn't look like it's sharing very well. Can you see it now?
There we go. I see something about to happen.
You see it?
No, I don't see anything.
No.
Oh, there we go.
Got it?
All right.
Okay.
There's someone in the crowd, Deborah. I hope you can see this.
Yeah.
That's useful for me as well. Yeah.
Okay. And happy to share this. Happy to share this afterwards as well.
Great. Thank you. Okay, let's move on to our next panelist, Dean Ho, Professor Dean Ho, who's the Provost Chair, Professor at the National University of Singapore, as well as the Director of a number of institutes involved with innovation and translational medicine. Dean, please.
Thank you so much for having me on this panel. Good morning, everybody. So I direct the N1 Institute for Health, also known as N1, as well as the Institute for Digital Medicine, known as Wisdom. And I'm also currently head of the Department of Biomedical Engineering. And I think some of the key things that we do at N1 and Wisdom are that we are clinical stage. So we have technologies that are currently being evaluated in human studies to personalize oncology care, as well as in the infectious disease space as well. And many months ago, we initiated a program in-house called N1.ID to leverage some of our AI platforms to develop ranked lists of optimized combinations against the coronavirus. And our objective there was to take a lot of the information we know about different drugs to come up with more actionability for the clinical community to know which combinations are likely to be more effective for patients. A critical thing about our AI platforms is that we do not use pre-existing training data to train algorithms. They are not purely computational platforms. And the reason for that is when developing novel drug combinations, we need data of different drugs put together at different dosages. And these parameter spaces can be as large as 1 trillion possible combinations from which we pinpoint the very best. And a lot of that data just doesn't exist. And so we run prospective experiments to drive all of our optimization processes, be it whether it's an oncology study that's in clinical trials, all the way to infectious disease studies. And the final thing I'll mention about both of these institutes is that we go well beyond technology. Our efforts leverage expertise from the global health, security, and surveillance community, healthcare economics community, et cetera, because we need all of that expertise to ensure that our technologies can be deployable in healthcare workflows around the world with different resources in hand, et cetera. And so it's truly a multidisciplinary effort. We have collaborations with the NUS Business School for the healthcare economics side, all the way to KPMG, and my buddy Chris Hardisty's on the call as well, looking at how we can, again, span this whole roadmap of developing technology and properly deploying it and making that technology sustainable. So thank you again for having me. I look forward to talking to everybody.
Thank you very much, Dean. Thank you. Kuldeep, please tell us something about Bioformis.
Absolutely. Thanks everyone again for having me. It's a pleasure being here. Bioformis is a digital therapeutics company, and we essentially, our entire mission at Bioformis has really been to improve patient outcomes while minimizing the cost and burden of care by really being able to deliver precise intervention at the right time. And the way we do that is really by being able to capture active passive data from patients using sensors and companion with a great user experience. We use a lot of data science and machine learning techniques to be able to really predict decompensation in patients ahead of a critical event, and then use our treatment algorithms or software-based therapeutics to really be able to intervene. And the final component is how do you integrate that into the clinical care pathways by providing clinicians and nurses the right appropriate tools to scale adoption. That's a simple formula. And as a company, we are primarily focused on three broad therapeutic areas: cardiovascular, respiratory, and oncology, with a pain component associated with it.
Thank you, Kuldeep. And finally, we have Hoob from Structo. Hoob.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good morning in Singapore. My name is Hoob. I'm one of the founders and the CEO of Structo. We are in normal times, we are a dental 3D printing company. We started in 2014 out of NUS. Actually, we were messing around with 3D printers there while studying mechanical engineering, myself and the other founders. What we do is we make hardware, software, and materials, which is kind of sort of the full solution package for 3D printing with a focus on dental applications. And the reason for that is that normally in the dental industry is one of the only places where 3D printing is really used as a mass production technology. Now, about 2 months ago, when the COVID situation started, the New York Times had a great chart showing sort of which professions and which industries are going to be most impacted by the virus. Dentists ranked extremely high because of their close contact with patients. Obviously, they're in people's mouths, and the number of patients they see on a daily basis, and sort of the non-essential nature of most of the treatment they do. So our industry took a pretty hard hit with everything closing down. But we were very fortunate to sort of be able to take some of the medical device grade printing materials that we developed for the dental space and leverage that to print swabs, nasopharyngeal swabs for diagnostic testing of the coronavirus. That's something we've been working on sort of for the last 6 weeks in collaboration with authorities, governments, healthcare groups throughout the region, throughout the world. And yeah, excited to share more about that today.
Thank you, Hoob. Thank you very much. So I have some questions for the panelists, and I'm gonna follow the same order and ask my first question to Bradley. So Bradley, I think there's been an inevitable overlay of politics, on top of the global community's efforts to deal with this pandemic. What is your assessment? I mean, is it a good thing, a bad thing? If it's a bad thing, is it surmountable? And, if it's possibly surmountable, how do we do it? How do individuals make a difference?
Thanks, Joey. Sure. I mean, there's been a lot of sort of commentary about how this could lead to a sort of a slowing down of globalization and increased tensions. And you see increased tensions even now, the sort of the war of words between China and the US and others. But, I think globalization over the medium term, or even now, I mean, it's driven by communication technologies, transport technologies. That's all going to continue, I think, in the medium and long term. And there is even still cooperation between, China, Harvard, US, or Europe working together on figuring out the viral genome. So there is still so much cooperation already going on. What I'm thinking, sort of the global context I'm thinking about is you see that what's happening here with the pandemic is sort of an acceleration of digitalization more broadly, right? I mean, changing how we do so many things, how we eat, how we work, how we are educated. And so what are the positive implications for that? How can we amplify the positive effects of this, for sure, accelerated digitalization around the world, especially in places where the digital divide is greatest, right? So I'm thinking about, like, how do we think about the medical field? How do we use this, in a sense, if there is a silver lining to all this, to drive the leapfrogging of development in countries in Africa? Like, how do we, for example, use this opportunity to use AI to drive telemedicine in rural areas of Africa, to just go to that, just quickly do that paradigm shift, because we're in a crisis, in a sense. But so that's the sort of positive side, and then, but there are all sorts of other global consequences here, right? Like, supply chains are breaking down in Africa and other places, and other parts of the world. There are impacts on food, and some economists have said they've never seen, the sort of situation where both supply chain, the supply side is collapsing and the demand side is collapsing, right? So, the UN World Food Program is projecting a doubling of people who are facing starvation simply because the supply chains are broken, right? And there, not even enough food being grown. So, nor is there the access to it. So there's certainly all sorts of consequences from a global point of view, but it's interesting too to look at the potential for this as it sort of forcibly drives this, a digital transformation even faster and harder, to figure out how we can amplify the positive aspects of that, right? And increase digital inclusion and increase the use of technology for better. So yeah, maybe those are sort of high level, but it'd be interesting to get the take of the experts.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that, Bradley. You talked a lot about, digital innovation as being central to the global response to this pandemic. Are there non-digital innovations that you see are critical in this?
You mean, well,
are there also analog solutions that we should be looking at?
Sure, not all of it is going to be about technologies and innovations too. It's just about different conceptions of what it means to, what does it mean to work productively together, right? Do we realize now that we don't necessarily need to have face-to-face meetings, for example? So what does it mean to learn the most effective way? It doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be a technical or technological innovation, for sure.
In your daily work, that might give us a good sense of how what the interplay between digital and non-digital methods might look like. In your work at the Center for Technology Innovation and Sustainable Development, it's one thing to work on curating ideas and trying to bring them to prototype, but ultimately, who do you work with? At what level? Of government, so to speak, or what is the unit of organization that you will eventually deal with? To get these ideas on the ground.
Like, for example, if we're helping a city government, we could be helping a city government design their new smart city plan, their new digital governance plans. In that case, be working with the city. It could be with governments at each level. It could be at community level too. It could also be with entrepreneurs. So many different levels. But we've just been asked to get involved in like the typical way of doing development would be to parachute in consultants and experts from abroad. But we've been trying to make it a shift for a long time to make it much more local and homegrown, and take advantage of entrepreneurs and innovators locally too, to drive innovation. So there's been that focus, but then now what happens with this sort of accelerated digitalization, right? So we've just been asked by one of the Nordic governments to help them with a program to bring capacity building education to ASEAN countries. Now, in the past, we'd send a lot of people there, and but now we're going to try to do that completely digitally, right? And how do we deliver that digitally? And that's so an example of how we think that development work might change dramatically too through all of this.
And you talked a lot about your work in Africa. I'm just curious, what was the thinking behind citing your center in Singapore?
I'm focusing on Africa because maybe there are some of the greatest needs and the greatest opportunities right now. But the citing of the center in Singapore is because there is so much going on in technology and innovation here, and there's such sort of a hive of activity here, but in areas that are especially relevant to, we think, like not just current global challenges, but future global challenges. Like the smart cities is a great example. Urbanization is just jacking up, accelerating at such an incredible pace. So what Singapore has got to say and the lessons learned from Singapore regarding urbanization for the whole world are really relevant, right? So that makes perfect sense. The future of food, I mean, it's a problem for everyone on the planet. And Singapore all of a sudden is really making a big push in this area. So I think it makes perfect sense. And Singapore's position too, just in Asia. So it's, yeah, for many reasons, but also through the generosity of the government that's supporting it, and the farsightedness, I think, of the government that's supporting it.
Thank you. Thanks, Bradley. I'm going to move on to Dean. Dean, people have been talking about precision medicine for a long time. Now, you've touched on it very briefly in your introduction, but what's different this time with the platform that you're trying to develop?
Thanks, Dewey. So we developed a platform called Identify, specifically for infectious diseases, where we run actual experiments with the live virus. We have a great team of collaborators here, from which we're basically interrogating a drug and dose parameter space that spans anywhere from hundreds of thousands of possible drug combinations all the way to even 1 trillion. And this tells us that we have to move beyond traditional drug screening. Right, in traditional drug development, we look at some drug targets, we maybe combine some drugs together and then see if they work. What Identify, how it differs is that instead of us thinking, hey, drug A and B should be pretty good, let's give it to the virus and cross our fingers, we're actually crowdsourcing the virus to tell us which drugs at which dosages work together to get the best response. And that's precisely where we don't use previously existing data to drive our optimization platform. We run different drug dose combinations on these plates of live virus, and then we interrogate and study this huge parameter space, and the viruses tell us this drug plus this drug plus this drug at these dosages eradicated everything, completely inhibited infection. So we're using prospective experiments to do the optimization. So what's the outcome? The outcome of that is a ranked list from the best inhibition combo all the way to the worst. And what this does is it gives the clinician options. If there's a drug shortage, if a certain drug is not available, the clinician can say, actually, I can't use the top ranked combo because I don't have that drug. Let's find the best ranked combination that has this drug and this drug and this drug, which I actually do have access to. If a patient has a comorbidity, right, where they can't take a certain drug, the clinician can say, actually, I can't use this drug, but I can use that drug. How efficacious, what's the ranking of that combination? And to kind of allude back to what Bradley mentioned about, what type of collaboration was needed to get this done. When Project Identify started, one of the first people we spoke to was a former US CDC epidemic intelligence officer. And we wanted to talk to him. He's an old friend of mine, because we wanted a global view of drug availability, of his view of which drugs would run into shortages, supply chain issues as well. And we wanted this first set of drugs to represent a global access viewpoint of, we want to make sure that these drugs would be available to the bulk of the world, and they would actually be implementable by a clinician, because he himself is an ID clinician. We leverage global health surveillance expertise from people in Boston, North Carolina. We work with NUS Business School here. And by the way, Rishi Desai, the clinician I'm talking about, he's based in the Bay Area. And then we have people here in Singapore that we're working with as well. And so when we talk about harnessing and developing Identify to come up with actionable combinations, it took a global effort to get that done. And then the culmination of this is now we are being contacted by clinicians from around the world, from Europe, from the US. We were talking to people from Taiwan just the other day in terms of preemptive preparation. If when they reopen the country, where are the answers, right? What are the combinations that we think could be best? Because we're about 5-6 months in now, right? But now we have answers of all the different drugs that are being tried. What was the best option available? And it was surprising in many regards, right? We found that remdesivir alone was the best monotherapy that we looked at, but remdesivir plus Kaletra created a 6.5-fold increase in efficacy compared to remdesivir alone. And this Rem-Kaletra combo was 30 times more effective than hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin. In fact, it was 3,000 times more effective than some other drugs that are being used in the clinic right now. And the final thing I'll say is this Identify platform is aligning with all the clinical trials that are being reported. Our platform is aligning with so far everything we've seen so far, right? And so this allows us some information on what drugs maybe we should pay more attention to and drugs we should pay less attention to, because every patient we put on a combination that's probably not going to work, that's a lost opportunity.
But this data at this stage is in vitro data, correct?
Correct. And so one thing that's absolutely correct. So this is in vitro data, but in contrast to standard drug screening, where you maybe find the best combo or best answer out of anywhere from 5, 10, 15, even a few thousand options, we're finding the best out of 1 trillion. And I'll give you one example of where we've seen success, where we took the in vitro derived combo, then took it to preclinical, re-optimized the dosing with our AI, then took it all the way to clinical, and we cut treatment time in half in human with tuberculosis. The combination we derived in vitro withstood all the way through to continue to emerge as the best combo in clinic. And we did this in human. We cut years off the development time. We cut orders of magnitude off the drug development costs. And when all was said and done, we basically gave the rights away to this drug combo. We had issued IP on it. We stopped pursuing those rights, and we're going to publish all the results and basically give away the opportunity to use this combo. We're doing the same thing with Identify. We are basically using this as a public benefit resource. Now, back to your question, starting off with the right drug combination is vital. And using traditional approaches, it's hard to really interrogate such a huge parameter space. We are doing that. And so we're finding a deterministic way of starting out on the best foot possible and then developing that.
And that's probably especially true in infectious diseases.
Absolutely.
But you know, I just have a very simple question, because it strikes me. I mean, how on earth do you do 1 trillion experiments?
That's the best part. We don't have to run 1 trillion. That's a great question. So I'll give you a simple example. Let's take 12 drugs. 12 is not a big number, right? And we worked with Rishi and other clinicians to determine which drugs to fit in that 12 drug set. Remdesivir, favipiravir, CQ, HCQ, all these drugs. 12 is not a big number, but let's try each drug at 10 different dosages, because what we've shown is that you can't just pick a couple drugs we want to use and then go dose finding. We actually have to find the right drugs at the right dose at the same time. That's why this parameter space is huge. And if drug 1 does not work on, say, the coronavirus, typically it's thrown out, right? In traditional screening, you don't think about it anymore. We leave it in because drug 1 plus drug 8 plus drug 9 at the right dose might actually be the best combo possible.
Yeah.
And maybe
but you actually have to do those experiments at different
doses. And so we don't
doses.
have to run them all. And the reason is, we have shown this quadratic relationship between drug dose in and efficacy safety out. Input and output, quadratic response. We have validated this in over 40 different diseases. It has never failed. It's oncology, ID, transplant, etc. Of course, this quadratic surface looks different from person to person. It can look different from population to population. But because we have this correlation, we don't have to run every single data point to draw out the true optimum. And
Incredible.
this one experiment gives us multiple options at the same time. So it's all about actionability.
Incredible. And I think there's probably going to be a very useful discussion between yourself and the next person I'm going to talk to, Kuldeep, who's also trying to do something similar. Kuldeep, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is your starting point was in cardiovascular disease, correct? So my question is, you know, how applicable are the parameters that you've been monitoring for cardiovascular disease? How applicable are they in the monitoring of, number one, infection, and number two, COVID-19 infection?
That's a great question. Thank you. So initially, when we started the company, we said, you know, we are going to focus on cardiometabolic diseases, right? And the idea really was, you know, monitoring patients, you know, post-discharge to really be able to drive outcomes. And we started with heart failure, and we said, what is the biggest clinical unmet need today? And if you look at the US or even globally, less than 1% of patients in the US are on optimal dosage. And less than 20% of these patients with heart failure have or are on guideline-directed medication therapy. And that's a huge problem because that essentially results in 1 in 4 patients coming back into the hospital within 30 days and billions of dollars in wastage. So we built our you know, digital therapeutics platform, what we call as BioVitals HF. And the platform essentially did 3 important things. The first thing was, you know, when a patient gets back into, you know, out of the hospital, how do you capture data from them with a great user experience? You know, flooding them with 3-4 sensors, compliance significantly drops, and we have seen multiple studies fail. Mm-hmm. So we had like 1 single device which can capture over 15 different physiological parameters continuously, and these are vital signs, combined with a patient-facing companion app for engagement and active data capture. So
and you're measuring these, sorry, Kuldeep, you're measuring these directly, or these are parameters that are input by the patients?
No, it's completely passive using a wearable sensor from a company which we acquired last year. It's an armband which you wear on the upper arm, can monitor all the vital signs which you see in the hospital, as well as multiple additional biomarkers depending on which disease we are looking at.
Okay.
And the second component for that really was to be able to predict decompensation in patients, which is heart failure exacerbation, and followed by how do you optimize therapy, which is essentially the right optimal dose to the right patient at the right time. And of course, we built the platform, we validated it in multiple clinical trials. And you know, from a prediction perspective, we showed, you know, on an average 14 days predictive capability before actual hospitalization or an ED visit, where clinicians can actually intervene. And then on the dose optimization, we showed significant, almost 50% improvement in optimization of therapy using our treatment algorithm, which essentially clinicians intervened. So once we built that whole platform, you know, it's nationally scaled. We had to go through, for every product development, we go through a typical drug development approach, right? All the way from research to pilot, FDA pre-subs, pivotal trials, and eventual FDA authorization. And right now it's commercialized in over 10 countries, you know, globally. But in that journey, what we essentially did was we moved into you know, building a platform for respiratory and infectious diseases, right? Specifically in oncology, you know, infection, sepsis, one of the biggest reasons why patients come back into the hospital after a typical chemotherapy or radiation therapy. And also respiratory conditions like COPD, asthma. And we tested the same platform, you know, in one of the studies at Brigham in the US, where we demonstrated using the platform almost, you know, 70% reduction in hospital readmission due to early prediction, as well as 38% reduction in overall cost of care. So when the COVID pandemic broke, we were certainly capturing all these physiological parameters. We had analytics platform built. So in a couple of weeks, actually, our team put together a platform for monitoring patients with COVID-19. And in fact, we were the first one end of January to roll out a program nationally in Hong Kong initially, where we were monitoring patients, who were quarantined in a specific facility. And we were essentially also monitoring patients in hospital in the isolation wards. And what it essentially included is a sensor which has the ability to capture key biometrics like, your typical temperature, pulse oximetry, respiration rate, heart rate, activity, blood pulse wave, etc. And we take that data along with patient, reported symptoms, use our analytics platform, which is of course cleared by the FDA, to be able to detect or predict, subtle physiological changes ahead of a critical event, and finally, eventually integrate that into clinical care pathways. And, right now, the same platform has been rolled out in over 5 countries. Especially, one of the things is not hospital by hospital, but nationwide by the Ministry of Health in 5 countries. We are now at this moment monitoring over 10,000 concurrent COVID patients, either positive or suspected, in multiple applications, all the way from people who are quarantined, people in the hospital in isolation facilities, and also, in the US, resources, hospital resources are very limited, and really being able to provide that home hospitalization to discharge low, medium risk patients, and monitor them back at home. And finally, the 4th biggest thing what we have been doing is monitoring healthcare staff. Because as you saw in China, 28% of patients or all the people who were, infected with COVID-19 were healthcare workers and clinicians. Using these 4 things, we have been, seeing impressive data in terms of the impact what we have been able to drive. In fact, you'll see a publication coming out in New England Journal of Medicine very soon, where we demonstrated the analytics platform had almost 98% sensitivity and 93% specificity in being able to detect COVID-related symptoms at least 3 to 4 days in advance before patient even got positive. And then on top of that, we also demonstrated, our BioVitals platform had significant correlation with your typical PCR values, which is the COVID test. And once we demonstrated that very early in February, researchers in Hong Kong, in fact, used our platform as a digital endpoint in one of their drug trials. And that was just published last week in Lancet, where it was, again, like Dean was mentioning, it's a combination therapy of 3 different drugs where, they actually tested it across the BioVitals platform to track drug efficacy and effectiveness, which is now in phase 3 clinical trials, which potentially will be approved soon.
Kuldeep, if you were an academic, you'd be a star, man. First in New England Journal and then now in Lancet. Incredible. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to quickly move on to Hoob because I want to also leave some time for the audience to ask some questions. Hoob, I have a very simple question. Why nasopharyngeal swabs? Nasopharyngeal swabs are, simple and cheap and can be made by the millions. Why do we need a 3D printed nasopharyngeal swab?
That is a very excellent question, and it's one we also asked ourselves. I think, if you look at the other panelists this morning, for us, the pivot was quite a bit bigger because we've never launched a medical device before. This was all completely new to us. So that was definitely a question that we sort of asked ourselves is, first of all, do we want to do this? Can we do this? And it's really, so the fundamental answer is one of the largest suppliers of conventional injection molded nasopharyngeal swabs. They're manufactured in northern Italy. And that was obviously hit very hard very early, and a lot of that production closed down. So when a supply chain crumbles like that, and suddenly every country in the world, every hospital in the world is scrambling to source the same part, and you get competitive bidding, you get sort of price gouging, then the ability to contribute in any way possible by just adding volume, adding capacity to the global sort of production capacity becomes viable. It's not so much a technology question of 3D printing versus injection molding versus other ways of doing it, as it is just adding to the total demand. We are, you know, when we embarked on this, we were looking at maybe we'll have to print thousands of these things, maybe tens of thousands. We're now producing on our order for the first 2 million, and we see requests coming in from countries and states requesting bids for 20 to 40 million swabs. So the demand is just shifted from the initial thinking is we're going to need these swabs to test everyone that has or potentially has COVID, right? And then you look at the case numbers and it's sort of in the hundreds of thousands. But now the idea is we're going to need these swabs to be able to reopen our economies, right? We're going to have to do systematic testing of society frequently. Then you're talking millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions to safely reopen before we do get to a vaccine or before we do get to a treatment.
So is there,
that's the objective.
Yeah. So just very quickly, I mean, are there any efficacy claims that you can make for a 3D printed swab? I mean, you know, is it got a design in such a way as to increase the yield of viral DNA that's captured, or
yes,
or you're not even making that claim? You're just addressing pure and simple a production, a logistic problem.
No, so that's a really good question. You know, when we decided to try it, we said if we do this, we do it properly. So we worked with various authorities, hospitals, doctors in Singapore and abroad to trial this. And so the challenge you have is that the conventional swab is an injection molded plastic swab, but it's flocked with cotton on the end, right? And that's an additional production step that's not easy to scale. So what we try to do is, can we print this thing purely out of plastic and use the advantages of 3D printing, namely that you can print certain geometries and internal hollow features that can't be molded, to still capture the same amount of specimens. So we did, actual trials of how much specimen can you collect with this plastic swab, and then for a given viral load, do the PCR tests and see that it is comparable in performance to the benchmarks, so to the conventional swabs. The biggest challenge in that was actually getting the hospital to give us some of their conventional swabs to do this test on, because they wanted to use every single one for patient trials or patient testing.
And just last question, are you cost competitive, or is that not an issue right now because the supply chains are so badly disrupted?
The short answer is yes, we are cost competitive today. We're probably 50% more expensive than an injection molded one, which is actually quite good considering it's a 3D printed part. And so that's competitive today. And I think now that we're looking at these kinds of volumes, there's actually great potential to scale this. We have some automation in the works that will help us take a lot of the manual costs out of it, and actually potentially make this long-term a competitive alternative to conventional swabs.
Thank you. Listen, I'm now going to open this up to questions from the floor, the virtual floor. So I have on my screen a list of questions, and I'm going to rank them based on the number of likes they have, just to keep things simple. So the first one is to Dean, and the question is, the race is now on to find a vaccine for COVID-19. What are the challenges in making this happen, and how soon can a vaccine be found? How can deep tech help to make this happen? And I'm assuming the second part of the question is how your platform can help to accelerate this, because there are obviously qualitative differences between a simple therapeutic and a vaccine. Dean, please.
Great, that's a great question. I think that we're all watching very carefully. And, you know, we've seen promising results from Moderna. There's some other vaccines being developed. And so I think we're just gonna have to wait and see. I have a number of close colleagues in this space. And again, I think there's two things. One is the time it takes to see data, and that will take still several months because they're still going over how to run these trials, right? Running vaccine trials are challenging in the sense that if you look at certain parts of the world where maybe at one point there were a lot of patients that you could run trials with, now these patients are starting to be cleared, right? And so there are going to be some challenges there. The second aspect is deploying these vaccines will also be challenging because governments will have to figure out how they're going to get that done. Companies are going to have to work together. Governments are going to have to work together. How do they price these vaccines? I think it's going to be another year or so at least. But an important one, since we're focused on deep tech here, is actually, I think with technologies like what we are working on, we envisioned identified to be kind of a first line of defense, where if the minute the virus is isolated, we can start coming up with therapeutic options that more effectively address the patients that are in the hospital in parallel with the vaccines and the antibody therapies that are being developed, right? If we look at, again, we're about 5-6 months in, there's over 300 clinical trials looking at repurposing. And if you look at our rankings, as we've shown, a lot of these drugs are not relatively effective when given in combinations, and there's a select few that could work well. If we have that answer earlier, we can help more patients while the vaccines are being developed. But we have a great panel here of people developing cool technology. When the vaccine is being trialed, when we start looking at, toxicity, if there are digital biomarkers available, like what Kuldeep is talking about, to monitor things like efficacy, different forms of efficacy in parallel with standard antibody readings, this is a great way to use data to track patients more effectively, which could accelerate a vaccine to people faster. So again, there's different lines of defense here. Using AI to develop better therapeutic interventions early while the vaccines are being developed, which that process alone, deep tech has a big role to play.
Thank you, Dean. I have another question. It's not mixed up in terms of the likes, but I think it's interesting because it can involve potentially every panelist here. So I'm just gonna ask this question. Great ideas in medicine and health often run directly into entrenched interest. Resistance to change in medicine is very strong. Fixing cardiometabolic disease requires lifestyle changes as much as medicine. How do the panelists successfully address entrenched interests? I'm gonna ask Kuldeep and then Hoob, Dean, and Bradley to say very, very quickly a few words because I notice we're about to run out of time. And if everyone's okay, we'll extend this by another 5 to 6 minutes. Kuldeep, please.
Yep, that's a great question. I think, in the healthcare industry, when essentially you get a product, either it is cardiometabolic or any other therapeutic area, I think there is, multiple aspects to it, right, for driving clinical adoption. First, really knowing who your end customer is. Even though whoever is your end customer, eventually it has to be prescribed by a clinician, and clinical adoption becomes critical. And for a hospital system, you really need to show them cost savings or improvement in outcomes. And I think one of the things I've always said is there are almost 40,000 apps in the market which have catered to cardiometabolic diseases. Clinicians don't know what to do with it. Patients don't know what to make of, and payers essentially don't know what to pay for. And really bridging that gap and being able to bring legitimacy by using data and showing outcomes really becomes critical. Once you do that, then I think the second thing is regulatory clearances. You need to be able to, get the right regulatory approvals in the right countries to drive clinical adoption. And finally, in the question, there was this whole resistance to change in medicine. you need to be able to have your product integrated into the clinical guidelines. For example, when we essentially built our heart failure product, built our treatment algorithms, we essentially partnered up with American Heart Association way early in the beginning. And right now, once the product was approved, it was integrated into AHA guidelines, which essentially every cardiologist in the world uses. So it has multiple aspects to it, all the way from financial benefits to being able to integrate it into the care pathways, the clinical guidelines, the right regulatory approval and validation.
Mm-hmm. Hoob, how about you, Hoob? I mean, I'll just modify that slightly differently. These nasopharyngeal swabs, these contracts that you have from different governments, is that a done deal? I mean, just because the government says, I want swabs from you, have you met resistance on the ground from the users of these new swabs? Because I must imagine that from a patient perspective, it must feel quite different.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, well, first off, I think as a consumer of healthcare, as we all are, I think resistance in healthcare is kind of what you want a little bit, right? You want your doctors to be studying things very, very carefully before they adopt a great idea, however great it might be. So equally, the nasopharyngeal swab, the printed nasopharyngeal swab, was greeted with quite some skepticism, and I think by sort of the medical community, including in Singapore. Initially, but I think what's important is that the doctors that we worked with to do the validation, while they're very, very sort of resistant to say, yes, let's go with this, they are extremely willing to be convinced by data and extremely willing to actually try things, right, on themselves. We've had doctors we sent them prototype swabs to sort of visually evaluate, and then to hear a few days later that they just swabbed themselves with it. They stuck it up their nose. And that's sort of, there's an extreme willingness to actually experiment and try things that might be great ideas. Just that, as Kuldeep also said, you have to get across the thresholds of the data, the regulatory approvals, to actually be able to then take it to the patient, which is the system working, right, I think.
Dean, what do you think?
Yes, it took years. It took years of having actionable data generated from our studies, prospective data, for the clinical community to mesh with our technology. But I think it's now manifesting. Not long ago, we started getting we get contacted pretty regularly by patients from around the world to potentially help out with their care, specifically for oncology. But we've now started getting requests from patients who themselves are doctors. And these are pretty notable colleagues who are medical faculty members from around the world who themselves may have some health issues, asking for help with or guidance with our AI platforms. So I think that's a good litmus test for us. And then especially with ID, seeing some of the data we've produced before, again, from prospective clinical trials, we have clinicians asking for where certain combinations rank to figure out whether they should pay attention or not pay attention to certain drug combos. But it took time and data.
Thank you. So it looks like from the medical and scientific community, as long as there is, number one, data, regulatory approval, and thought leadership, it works. People are prepared. Scientists are prepared to be convinced by data. Brad, it's not so simple in politics. If we take the example of Sanofi Aventis, whose vaccine was funded by the US government, but it's a French company. I think, when news of that broke out, I mean, that would be a classic example of an entrenched interest that needs to be overcome. If you were CEO of Sanofi Aventis, and if you could do it all over again, how would you deal with it?
Man, I would deal with that by asking you and Dean how you would deal with it. No, I mean, I guess a connected question to that. I mean, yeah, I mean, all these crazy stories now, but one country trying to buy up the vaccines of another country, and countries spying on other countries' vaccines and so forth. But I guess a question for you, Jui and Dean. I'm not just doing this tactic of reversing questions on you. Connected. I wonder, have you guys seen already changes in regulatory frameworks, or what's happening at the policy level globally that is helping accelerate innovation, right? That's going to help affect the whole world. I mean, what are the big things that are happening? What are the big things that need to happen, like at a global level, at the regulatory and policy framework level, to make things really work, right? To get rid of some of these entrenched interests, or at least put them to a side for a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I think the good news is certainly in Singapore, we're seeing the HSA respond very quickly. I think you might have seen in the news quite a number of diagnostics have come through very, very quickly in a matter of a month in some instances. I understand that is the case in the US as well. I think, Gilead's drug would be a great example. I mean, they're being accelerated through the clinical trial stages. So I think that's the good news. I think at the working level, at the ground level, people understand there is a need to be able to respond quickly. I hope that sufficiently changes mindsets and infrastructures so that when the next crisis hits us, that these lessons will not have been forgotten. But just maybe one final word from my side. I mean, I do find it very sad that, the WHO is being sort of, scapegoated, or, I'm trying to be as sensitive as possible to all of this too, but that's, I mean, what you need now is more global coordination at that kind of level than less, right? And it's a shame that it's just a terrible sideshow and distraction in my. Absolutely.
I'll jump in really quickly.
Yeah, please.
So I actually serve on a WHO working group on AI for health, specifically in the regulatory space. And it's been nice to see the level of dialogue occurring from the regulatory agencies from across the world to try to accelerate AI platforms into broad use. And I'll echo Jui's mentioning of HSA. HSA has been immensely helpful to us for guidances. We got a trial approved within 2 weeks for a prospective interventional oncology study that led to a patient having progression-free survival that way surpassed general averages. So the HSA has been a major help for us with regards to knowledge, accessibility, and just being with us step by step the whole way. And so it's been wonderful working with them.
Dean, you just saved me from having to end on a grim note. So I must thank you. And I'm very conscious of the fact that we've overrun by about 10 minutes. So I'm going to end the session here and thank each and every one of you very, very profusely. This has been a wonderful session, and we look forward to having you speak again. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. Thank you, Bradley, Dean, Hoop, and Kudip as well. I would also like to thank our 100 or so attendees who have stayed with us throughout the session so far, and many have shared the comments that it's been an enlightening session and discussion. At this point in time, I would like to just take a quick print screen to commemorate the event with you guys. So it would be great if I could trouble you to just have a wave at the audience at a moment so that I could just take that screenshot, please. Very nice. All right, just hold on there for 1 second. All right, all smile. Perfect. Perfect. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.
Okay, have a good day, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Everyone.
Thank you, Joy. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Take care. Stay safe.
Thanks.
Likewise. Bye-bye.
Bye.